Mission Chats with Jon Crowe.
Well, hello again. Wonderful to be back on the air, as it were. And today's guest, Josh Summers, is someone who reached out to me and just said, "Hey, would you be interested to hear a little more of my story?" So first of all, I'd say if that's you as well, definitely reach out. Always looking for more people to bring on the show and just hear a bit about what God's doing in their lives and through their lives. And so that's what today's episode will be about. And Josh, I'm not going to say too much more, but just love to hand it over to you and tell us who you are, how the Lord brought you to faith, and how he brought you into serving full-time in missions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate just the opportunity to be able to join you and chat a little bit more. As you said, my name's Josh, and I actually grew up in Dallas, Texas, where at this moment I'm in right now. Right. We currently live in Thailand. I've got my wife. I've got two boys that are aged 12 and 7. And the great thing is I was blessed to be able to grow up in a Christian home. And I've heard different people talk, and there's a wide range of what that means. And I would say that, my family were really strong believers, which was neat. And we had a good church. And I distinctly remember, it's a very strong memory for me growing up, going on mission trips. And, I know that there's debate about the value of short-term mission trips, all that stuff. But I do know that for myself, just being able to experience what it's like to be in another country and to kind of step into somebody else's world and different language, different culture, all of that stuff, it was just fascinating to me. And then this idea of being able to share my faith and actually getting comfortable with that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I remember part of that whole part of being in, youth group was just, hey, let's share your faith, share your testimony and just be comfortable doing it. And it's surprising how, at least as a teenager, it takes a little work to get, comfortable doing that. Yeah. And that kind of led us down a path that eventually ended up overseas for the majority of my adult life.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's always neat to see. I mean, I just actually came back from a short-term mission trip, and it's a summer mission trip, and so we had some young folks participating. And for me, it's a huge kind of an excitement, let's say, as you see young people work out how they're going to share their faith and what their story is, and how they present the gospel, even in a simple way, but actually a complete way as well. And so that's lovely. I love to hear that. That's where you sort of got your feet wet, as it were. And sometimes I think that's the bigger value, right? It's not necessarily what being accomplished in the mission field context, but more the exposure and the awareness, and just 100% of the eyes. So so you mentioned kind of starting out in China. Tell me how that came about. Tell me who you served with and the goal of that time, and then we'll follow the journey along from there.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, hopefully this will be encouragement to some people, because I don't have this moment of in the book of Daniel where God wrote on the wall and said, you're going to China and you're going to serve in missions. The reality is my wife and I got married. We know we wanted to move overseas just for the experience of it all. And honestly, China was the last place either of us would have considered. We both spoke Spanish. We were trying to find, we weren't going through a missions agency or anything. It was just, hey, we want to go overseas and we'll just teach English. Right. So the Peace Corps, anything like that, and everything it was a door shut for us, except for this one opportunity in western, very remote part of China, which if anybody knows Xinjiang, we're out near the Kazakh border, the Tajik border, we were way out there. And that is the way that God used to get me out there. And it was through, spending 4 years teaching English out in that part of the world that I personally fell in love with the culture and that people group. There's the Uyghur, there's the Chinese, there's the Hui, there's a lot of different, there's Kazakh, there's a lot of different people that kind of just melt in that part of the world. And I think God knows me best. And I think, if he had come and written on the wall, it would have, I would have been really stubborn on that. But if he dangled adventure, hey, you're going to a place where there are no other foreigners and you get to explore and do all these things, that drew me in. And once I was there, that's what really, I started digging roots, and my wife and I just loved being there.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. And it's funny you mentioned adventure, because I think that was the beginning of my journey too. I served for a number of years with OM Ships. They run a ship ministry. And to me, the idea of living on a ship, traveling the world was probably in one part a piece of what attracted me to it. Of course, from there it grew into a wider understanding of what missions was. But that adventure concept, I think the Lord does use that in some people's lives. That's cool. So you mentioned that you were teaching English kind of as a step into China, as it were.
Yeah,
If I understood right, you said that was for maybe half the time you were there. So
correct.
how did that kind of morph? What did it look like for the rest of your time? And also, what brought that time in China to an end?
First things first, the time in China ended very abruptly. I usually put it into two halves, the first half and the second half, and both kind of ended in an interesting way. So the first half ended with riots. So again, for those who may or may not know, in that part of China, it was right around the time of the Olympics in China. So it was shortly thereafter in 2009. There were riots in the streets of the capital of that part of China in Xinjiang. So Urumqi is the capital city. Hundreds of people, unfortunately, lost their lives, and it was a really big ordeal. Like the internet was cut off, police presence was just ratcheted up to an insane level while we were there, and it kind of became impossible to just continue to live there.
Yeah. Sure.
And there were a couple things we realized as we were doing that. One is we realized how alone we actually were, and kind of the fact that we didn't have great support. We were just out there as teachers, right? Our church knew we were out there. Our family obviously knew we were out there, but we didn't have much of a support network. So we were kind of on our own to process what had just happened, which was a huge thing, in that part of the world. And then to try to figure things out for ourselves. And so we decided to go back home to the US for a little while. And as I'm leaving, I remember thinking to myself, if we were ever to come back, I'm starting to see the value of having some kind of, mission support, like if, those or a team or just people that you're out there with. We knew we could survive on our own.
Sure.
But I don't like this idea of being a Lone Ranger. I don't want to be a Lone Ranger. So it's just this, okay, well, if we go back, that's something that's of value to me. And it took 3 years. We were settled in the US, we had my first son, and it wasn't until 3 years later that we felt God really strongly call us back to that region. And that's when we said, okay, let's start having serious conversations with our church and start looking into what it would be like to actually go with an agency or go with a missions organization of some kind. And that's what got us connected with Pioneers, and we eventually were back out in that part of the world. And this time I was studying language with the idea of, all right, I'm going to do business. That was it's been my passion. It's something I love. It's what I studied in university. And so that's what we did. It was about a year or 2 years in language. And then I transitioned over to a business visa, which was a ton of fun. Really enjoyed that. So the second season was definitely different. It was different in that, we, instead of being on our own and in a very remote, we were in a much further, a city way out, in the desert. Whereas this time, we were in the capital. It's the only place you can really study the language and start a business easily, and with people. And it was fantastic. Like, we had people that loved us, that we loved. And then, of course, getting to know, we had some great local neighbors, and part of we get asked what was our ministry out there. And one of the things that I learned very quickly is there were things that I wanted to do, but in different parts of the world, you don't have as much control over things like where you live, or the police dictated where we were allowed to live. And so what we learned quickly was that, hey, our ministry, or at least what really works well for us, is the people that we're in close community with, the people who are our neighbors, the people who live in the building across the street, who go to the same grocery store right outside our apartment building, all of those things. And we were constantly have to move because of politics and security, the police and everything. And so one place, it was Uyghur neighbors, and that became our focus. And then in other location, it was Hui, and which is kind of like this Chinese Muslim group that lives out in Western and central China as well. And our ministry was the local that we happen to be in community with, right? The people group, and they tend to congregate together.
Sure.
And so I'll go into this part of the story, which is a really difficult part, and it's a very politically sensitive part of China. So China and the people group, the Uyghur that are the majority out there, have been somewhat at odds, and that's part of what the riots were in 2009 that I mentioned. It was just kind of that tension boiling to the surface. And then in 2018, so fast forward, this was, when we had been in the capital city for a while, and I was doing business. And part of what I did was I was a travel writer. I worked for Lonely Planet back when Lonely Planet was a thing, which funny, I've talked to different groups, especially college groups and younger, and I talk about Lonely Planet. They have no clue what I'm talking about. But, I used to write for that Big Blue book, and I wrote my own travel guide to that region. And I loved just being able to use my platform to be able to, one, bring business to local business owners who are doing travel, but also to just kind of get out beyond the bubble of my little neighborhood or city or something like that. The problem is when you're dealing with a sensitive, politically sensitive area, and you're running around with a camera and you're running around talking and essentially interviewing people, it just doesn't look really good. I see that now in hindsight. At the time, I was thinking that I was, hey, this is a great reason to be here. There are very few good reasons to be out in that part of the world, but doing tourism and bringing tourists to that region, helping economically, that felt like it was a really good reason until they took me in. And that kicked off it was 17 days. And, my wife and I were both interrogated. They were threatening me with 2 to 10 years in prison at that time, just on accusations of being a spy, which until you realize that, sure, I'm not a spy, but how do you prove that? Like, it's my word against theirs. And when you're faced up against that, and then every day that they're taking me away from my family and I'm saying goodbye to my boys who are at that point like 2 and 5 years old and don't know what's going on. And I'm exiting the door with police being led away to an interrogation facility. And for all I know, that's the last I'm going to see my boys for the next few years. Like it really sinks down hard. And there's a lot that God taught me through that whole ordeal. And we can go into that later if you want. But at the end of the day, it was a traumatic experience for my wife and I to have to go through. And by God's grace, they decided that we weren't worth the political hassle and the effort and all of that. And so after 17 days, they just gave us our passports back. They had taken everything from us. They had taken my computer, phone, like they were rummaging through all the digital files that I'd ever taken. They gave some of that back to me. They gave us our passports back, and they basically said, you are now, we had to sign a declaration, of guilt of being believers that are sharing the gospel in that part of the world. And then we were banished from coming back. I don't know for how long, and I don't know, like, it's just not something I'm going to test as long as the current administration is in power, but we're now gone from China, and that part of our lives, that chapter is ended.
Wow. So it kind of sounds like a hard stop, if you will, not something that you saw coming and planned for, but rather just step out, kind of almost one day to the next type of thing. How have you guys processed that idea that not really having a chance to, to work it through on the local end and just stepping out like that? Has it been, I imagine that's been tough, but what's that look like for you guys?
It has been tough. I mean, if you can imagine, when they gave us our passports, they gave us 24 hours to get out. And it didn't take us more than 3 hours to pack up. At that point, I wanted to get out. Right. And so we closed the door on our apartment, gave the keys to a local friend, but basically closed the doors on our apartment. And it looked like we were going out to eat. Like everything was still there. Except for the suitcases that we could carry in our hands. So it was a very quick exit and very little goodbye. Whether that was to our things, as dumb as that sounds, like my oldest still talks about, that one Matchbox car that we left behind that we didn't think was that valuable, but to him that was like super valuable. Obviously up to the friendships that we had. So my wife and I celebrated 19 years of marriage this last month, and we went out to New York City and we watched the play Hamilton. There's a line in Hamilton that really struck me where Hamilton says, what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never see. And when I think about my time in China, like it pains me to think about all the relationships that I never got to get closure, right? The way that we left, it means that I don't feel comfortable reaching back out to them because I don't know if it would endanger them being in contact with me. So there are a bunch of people that, as far as I know, we just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Okay.
They never got a goodbye.
Yeah.
We never got to finish the conversations that we've been having. Hopefully, the witness that we had over the years of being there and pouring into their lives and loving them and their kids left an impact. But it just it goes back to that Hamilton line where it's like a lot of what we end up doing, not just us, but I think in life in general, is planting seeds in a garden that we're never going to get to see. And just being comfortable with that and being okay and saying, God, this is in your hands. I miss these people, but this is in your hands.
Right. No, that's a good word. Yeah. Thank you. Now, I think timing wise, where was COVID in the timeline from there? When did you leave China? When did you start your next ministry phase? And where did COVID kind of overlap with that?
Yeah, we left China in 2018, spent a year in the US until we felt called to go out back to Asia, to Thailand. And so that was at the end of 2019. So we had 5 months before COVID hit, and we spent most of COVID in Thailand, where we currently call home.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
So kind of hold up, I guess, like most of everywhere else in the world, kind of wondering, Lord, why am I here? Maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
we'd only been there for 5 months. So ministry hadn't really been strongly established at that point. So it was, like for everybody else, just a really interesting time. Thailand did lock down for the most part, but it also meant like Thailand's very much dependent upon tourism and travel. Yeah. And when that all shut down, they tried to encourage people inside the country, to do domestic travel. Yeah. So the cool thing was we got to kind of visit and tour, like get to see more of Thailand, because there wasn't much else that we could do. Like once things opened up internally, but they still weren't letting people in and out.
Right. Well, Josh, thanks so much for, just being open to sharing some of that struggle and difficulty.
I'm going to pause the chat at this point, and in the next episode, we'll hear more about Josh's current ministry and what the Lord has given him as a platform to do what he does today. So tune in next time to hear a little bit more of Josh's story.
Find us online at missionchats.com.